Okay, hi everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for inviting me here to talk to you. Apologies for the slight delay in the start. My name is Dr. Elsa Panciroli and I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to talk to you about the evolution of mammals, but it's the story that's told in my book, Beast Before Us. So let's get started. So first of all, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself, who I am and what I do. So I'm a researcher at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and it's one of the oldest museums in the world. And we have this really stunning collection, not just because we have, of course, amazing objects. All museums have amazing objects, but because we're such an old museum, our collections, some of them date back to the 1600s. And we have things like the only soft tissue of the extinct dodo from Mauritius. And we also have the first ever dinosaur that was ever described by science, which is called Megalosaurus, as well as the specimens that I'm personally most interested in, which are some of the earliest mammals from the time of dinosaurs that were ever described. And they were actually described at the same time as the dinosaurs and were equally revolutionary in what they told us about evolution. And some of that story is what we're going to talk about today. So I'm a paleontologist and I study extinct life in general, but I'm particularly interested in where mammals come from. We'll talk in a moment about mammals and what that term exactly means in a moment. But the other thing that I do with my time is I do a lot of field work. So this is a photograph of myself and my colleague working on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. So you might have heard of the Isle of Skye. It's renowned for its natural beauty, but it also has an incredible geological record. So the rocks, many of the rocks are, well, there's two ages there. Some of the rocks, like the mountains you see in the background, are relatively young. And by young, I'm talking geologically. So they're like 66 million years old. That's very young for rocks. But the rocks that you see us sitting on there and looking for fossils are much older. They're middle Jurassic, so they're 160 million years old. So very, very much older than the mountains around them. And they contain the fossils of dinosaurs, but also the animals that lived alongside them, such as pterosaurs, but also the first mammals, salamanders, small reptiles, turtles, crocodiles, all the kinds of things that we see today. They kind of have their beginning at the same time. So it's a really fascinating time period and a really brilliant fossil record on the island. So some of the specimens I've been working on from that site are things like this. These are two reconstructions of the skulls of an animal called Borealis from the Middle Jurassic. I don't know if any of you know how small a 5p piece is in British money, but it's the smallest coin. It is very, very tiny. So you can see these animals are really little. So I'm very interested in tiny creatures, very small vertebrates. So I published this book a couple of years ago, and here's some of the lovely images people have sent me of them reading it in different locations around the world. I really love to get these. It's so nice to see the story out there. But this story is the story of mammals. And I think before we go on, I should kind of clarify what mammals are. And I'm sure most of you are well aware of what they are, but let's just kind of go over a few points just to make sure we're on the same page. So here's a selection of some examples of mammals. And of course, we live in what's quite often called the age of mammals. And it's not actually because they have the largest number of species, because there's actually more species of bird and reptile, but it's because they have the widest range of body size and body shape, their morphology. So everything from tiny little, bumblebee bats, which are only a couple of grams in weight, all the way up to, of course, the blue whale, which is the biggest creature that's ever lived on the planet, and everything in between. And they live in every environment, in every continent. So that's the reason it's the age of mammals, is just because mammals are kind of doing it all right now. And of course, they include humans. We are, of course, part of this group. Now, if I was to ask you what sort of things make a mammal, there's lots of different traits, but there's a few things that are kind of key. So one of the things that you might say to me is that mammals feed milk to their young. And that's absolutely true. That is one of the most important defining features of mammals. No other animal group produces milk. It's a very particular substance that only mammals create. So that's one of our defining features. Another one is that we, as a group, have hair or fur. And as you can see from this really luxurious looking horse, some mammals, of course, have a lot more hair than others. And there are, of course, groups that have secondarily lost a loss of their hair. But even for those groups, things like whales, the marine mammals, quite often very early in their growth, they still have one or two little whiskers that will fall out later on as they grow. So you can see that kind of echo of the past. They come from haired ancestors. Something that you might not be aware of is that mammals also have really complex middle ears. So you can see here that there are 3 bones in the middle ear in mammals, whereas in birds and other reptiles, there's only 1, the stapes. Now we're going to come back to where those bones come from and why they're significant later on, but they are another unique trait. And there's lots of other very detailed sort of traits of the anatomy, but those are 3 really big sort of important ones that make mammals mammals. And of course, there are also 3 major groups of mammals on the planet today. The placental mammals, which is the group that we belong to. And these are generally sort of, there's again, a few different things that unite the group. But one of the big things is that they have a very long pregnancy and then give birth to relatively well-developed young compared to the second group, and that's the marsupials. So there's a lot more placental mammals on our planet than there are marsupials. They're the next smallest group. And they've taken a different strategy. They still give birth to live young, but they give birth to them in a much less developed state than placental mammals. And those young then complete their development by feeding on milk, usually in the marsupium in the pouch. So it's another really great strategy for survival, but a sort of different emphasis. We emphasize the gestation, the pregnancy, and they emphasize the milk giving and the sort of post-birth period. And here you can see an example of one of these little newborn marsupials. I mean, they really are, they're no bigger than jelly beans. They're absolutely tiny and really underdeveloped by comparison to placental mammals. And you can see it latches onto the teat there. And of course, much later on, when it's well developed, it can then leave the marsupium and continue life as a grown-up. And then we have the final group, my personal favorites, the monotremes. And there aren't very many species of them on the planet today, although they used to be a much bushier group. There was a lot more in the past. The only ones left are the platypus and then several species of echidna. And they're unique for many different reasons, but one of the principal ones being that they're the only mammal group that lays eggs. And you can see an example there of how small these eggs are. They're very, very little, but those young do still feed on milk in the nest with the mother, like any other mammal. So as I say, yes, they still have fur and they still feed on milk. So they are definitely still very much true mammals. They've just retained the fact that they lay eggs. And of course, all mammals at one point, their ancestors all laid eggs. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of mammals so that we all know what we're talking about today. And if you were to ask somebody to tell the story of where mammals come from, most people and most books and most television programs, they begin the story here. This is that really infamous moment 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous when an asteroid hit our planet. And it caused mass destruction all around the world. And of course, very famously put an end to the non-bird dinosaurs, as well as actually several other groups, such as the marine and flying reptiles, and of course, lots and lots of other species. So you quite often are given the impression that really mammals weren't doing very much until this point, and that it wasn't until the asteroid hit and removed the dinosaurs that mammals kind of started to get interesting and really appear. But I'm here to tell you that that's really not the real story at all. Mammals have a massive, long evolutionary history that stretches right back as far as the dinosaurs and much, much further back in time. Because when you look at a sort of simplified diagram of the mammal family tree, the bigger mammal family tree, you see all of us here at the end in what's called the age of mammals, the Cenozoic. But you can actually trace us back to our common ancestry all the way back into the Carboniferous, over 300 million years ago, to our ancient, what's called a synapsid ancestor. And it's that bigger story that I want to tell you now. It's why my book's subtitle is the Untold story, because most people, most books and television programs, they don't really talk about that incredibly long and really, really diverse and exciting history. So let's look at that. So the first thing I want to do is take you right back to the Carboniferous. This is a really incredible time period because we see the Earth is a planet that's kind of somehow recognizable and yet totally alien. So the temperature globally was a lot higher. It was warm and humid. The planet was covered in these swampy forests, but the trees, they're not actually trees as we know them. They're related to quillworts and club mosses, which today are tiny little plants that just live at the, the understory of a forest. But back then, their ancient relatives were, 30 meters tall. They were proper, enormous sized trees. And there was no flowers or grasses. Those things hadn't evolved yet, but there were lots of things like ferns and mosses. And as well as that, we have an incredibly high level of atmospheric oxygen. And one of the byproducts of that is that we have enormous insects in this time period. So there you can see in this picture is a dragonfly. Well, it's an ancient dragonfly relative. It was about the size of a seagull. So it's absolutely huge. As well as that, there were also giant centipedes as big as motorbikes. They're absolutely huge. Now, in this incredibly bizarre time period, we do have the first vertebrates, the first backboned animals. They've come out of the water. They, of course, have evolved from bony fishes. So they are now out of the water, able to breathe air. But what exactly are these creatures? Well, at this point in time, you might hear some books describe them as amphibians or even as reptiles. And you might think I'm going to tell you they're mammals. But the correct term for these very first four-limbed backboned animals is tetrapods. And the reason that we have to be specific about the terminology is because they, of course, are the ancestors of all those groups of mammals and reptiles, amphibians. But at this point in time, they don't belong to any of those groups because they are something before. They are the common ancestors. So here we have this Carboniferous period with all these incredible tetrapods, the ancestors of all the vertebrate animals today. And the first branch to break off in the family tree is the branch that eventually includes the amphibians. So creatures like this newt here, but also frogs and caecilians are the other group. Now, these animals are called anamniotes. And there's, again, like I was saying with the definition of mammals, there's lots of different things in their anatomy that defines what an anamniote tetrapod is. But we're going to focus on one thing in particular, and that's its eggs. So amniote refers to something that is within the reproductive, the egg part that they lay. So they're anamniotes because they don't have this thing called an amnion, which we're going to come back to in a moment. Instead, they lay this jelly-like substance. You'll have seen it in ponds. It doesn't have an outer shell. It needs to be kept moist in water for the young to develop and for them to pass oxygen through the jelly that surrounds them in order for them to develop. Now, this is obviously a really successful way to reproduce because they're still doing it today. If it wasn't successful, then it wouldn't have continued. But it does mean that these animals are tied to finding somewhere wet and moist in order to reproduce. So it does limit their habitats a little bit. But the next group that was to split off and was to evolve were the amniote tetrapods. And they have this amazing evolutionary innovation that they enclosed their eggs in a shell. Not a hard shell like a bird's egg, but more like reptile eggs are, kind of soft and leathery shell. Now, this might not seem like it's particularly important, but it really was, because it meant that for the first time, these particular tetrapods were not tied to the water's edge. So they could begin to explore new habitats and begin to diversify and change their modes of life. So these amniote tetrapods, this is the path, the evolutionary path that we're going to start walking down now. So the next thing to look at is, among these amniote tetrapods, we have another split in the family. And they split into two major groups, the diapsids and the synapsids. So again, there's a whole bunch of different things that define these two groups, but one of the things I'm going to pick out that's important is, if you look at those skulls in each corner, can you see behind the eye, I've highlighted in blue, that there's a hole behind the eye in each side of the skull. Now, in the diapsids, there's usually two of these holes, although it sometimes varies a bit. They're a bit complicated, but I'll not tell you that story. That's for someone else to tell you, because what we're interested in is the other group there, the synapsids. They have one hole behind their eye on each side of the skull, and that is a rule. They always have only one hole. And this is one of the defining features of the group that we also belong to, that the mammals belong to. We are synapsids. And so this moment where these two groups split, that's really where our earliest beginnings are, because these two groups end up including, on the diapsid side, the reptiles, and on the synapsid side, the mammals like ourselves. So if you really want to figure out where our origins are, I would suggest that it's in the Carboniferous when we have this moment, and we hit the sort of synapsid highway. So I want to start telling you the story of these early synapsids. And you might wonder, what do these creatures look like? Well, you've got a kind of image here of the sorts of things. They do look, let's go to the next page here. They do look superficially, I guess what you might say was reptilian. But again, I would encourage you to think about it a little bit differently. It's more that reptiles still look kind of tetrapody, early tetrapody. So what I mean by that is that the reason they look reptilian is because reptiles haven't changed their body plan as much as mammals have. So mammals look very, very different, but they are equally related to one another, if you know what I mean. Like reptiles and mammals have a common ancestor. So these early synapsids look reptilian, but they're not. They are our early ancestors, in fact. And this one here is one called Echinarpeton, and it was found in Nova Scotia. In the background there is a picture of, that's the rock face with a preserved tree stump, one of those trees I was talking about that's technically not a tree, it's a type of club moss. And it was actually that you find their fossils curled up sometimes inside those tree trunks, maybe nesting, maybe kind of hiding or away, or perhaps hunting for food. So yeah, they can be quite beautifully preserved. So we're all related to creatures like this. It's about the length of your forearm, something like that. But very quickly after these first synapsids, our family tree begins to flourish. So going into the end of the Carboniferous and into the next time period, Permian, we start to get some characters that you might recognize. And this is one of them. This is an animal called Dimetrodon, which most people know as the one with the sailback, because it's got this absolutely crazy big spine with all these huge spikes. It's always been a real puzzle as to what exactly the huge sail is for. And it's not just this Dimetrodon has it, but lots of other creatures in this time also have this big sail. There's another one in that drawing in the background called a Dilophosaurus, which not only has the spikes up the way, but then has these bizarre spikes that come out sideways. So we really don't know what those are for. And there's been a lot of theories about what the spines might do. One of the ones that used to be popular is that it perhaps used it to bask in the sun and heat up and cool down. But actually, there's been a lot of testing of that to see whether that would actually work, in terms of the mechanics and the heat and everything, heat regulation. And I think that probably isn't actually what it's for, because it doesn't seem to work. What they think now is that it's a little bit simpler than that. Possibly this was just a way that the animal made itself look bigger. Maybe it was used for competition, perhaps to scare off a rival or to attract a mate. Maybe it was brightly coloured, who knows? And Dimetrodon could be anything from, there are some species that are relatively small, about the size of a dog, right the way up to, about sort of 2-3 meter long animals. So that some of them were really quite huge, and also have some of the first adaptations for carnivory, for eating other animals. And I also think Dimetrodon is really interesting from a slightly different perspective. In my book, I like to talk about some of the history of discovery of some of these fossils. And I would encourage people to think beyond just the kind of simple narrative we have of their discovery. So for example, Dimetrodon, you might read that Dimetrodon was first described by Edward Drinker Cope, who was given the fossils by this guy called Jacob Ball, who was a Swiss naturalist. And they were found in these Texas red beds that you see pictured here. And it is true, that's the sort of simple scientific story of them being discovered and described by Cope and named and everything. But actually, their fossils were found much, much earlier by the indigenous people of North America. So for example, the Comanche found them in places like Oklahoma, where the Texas red beds also outcrop. They had found their fossils before, and they had a very good understanding, of course, of animal anatomy through hunting and butchery. So they had quite a lot of very accurate interpretations of what these animals were. So it's very interesting to start to consider these slightly different histories and different interpretations and meanings for some of these fossils. So I encourage you, with whatever fossil group that you're interested in, to maybe do a bit of research along these areas and try and find out, who else has found these fossils and what they meant to them. Now, that was the sort of beginning of the Permian, and now we're moving right into the Permian proper. So this is over 252 million years ago, well before the dinosaurs existed. And it was our ancestors, these synapsids, that began to flourish. And I talked about this being the age of mammals that we live in now. And in the book, I joke that this is kind of the first age of mammals, although of course they're not mammals at this point, but they are part of the same bigger family, the synapsids. And I wanted to show you some of the diversity of these creatures. So in the Permian, we have this group here is a group of plant eaters, herbivores. Now, being a plant eater is quite a difficult thing for any animal to do, actually, because plants don't have a lot of nutrition. So it's an adaptation that's quite tricky for any group to evolve. But we did it first. Our synapsids, we have a whole bunch of our ancient relatives that were the first ones to develop this mode of life. And some of them, like moss chops there and Steminosuchus, they're really huge animals. They can be several meters long, really chunky, built like a bit like bouncers, kind of similar to a very large cow or livestock that we have today. And of course, where you get large herbivores, you invariably get large predators to feed on them as well. And so it was in the Permian. We have animals like these ones pictured here, creatures called Gorgonopsians, and Gorgonops there is like the kind of poster child for that group. And these are the sort of tigers of the Permian. They are really big, muscular animals, fast moving. They have saber teeth, really sharp teeth for processing meat. They would have been absolutely terrifying creatures. So they're living alongside these animals in a very recognizable ecosystem. This is something that we see today, mega herbivores, mega carnivores predating them. So we're beginning to see the makings of a kind of world that we recognize. And of course, we have all the slightly more subtle characters, including some of the first tree-dwelling vertebrate animals, burrowers, and that little creature down there, Procinosuchus, is actually one of the earliest members on our specific line among the synapsids, the cynodonts. And we're going to come back to that in a little moment. So the Permian is this incredible flourishing of synapsids. They got off the mark and began to be really diverse and do all these exciting things much faster than the reptiles did. And long before, of course, the dinosaurs and the age of the dinosaurs. I'm going to focus on a couple of them in particular, which I think are really have amazing fossils and are quite interesting to look at. So Stegosaurus, well, I mean, you know, what do I need to say? Just look at that skull. It is the most bizarre looking ancient creature. It has these horns that come out not only of its forehead, but also its cheeks. I mean, yeah, well, it's got a face only a mother could love, really, doesn't it? But one of the cool things about its fossils, so this fossil is pictured in the Royal Tyrrell Museum, but the original is in Russia in the Paleontological Institute in Moscow. And one of the fossils of Stegosaurus actually has skin preserved in the fossil. It's one of the oldest skin preservations in the fossil record. And that's a picture of it there. Now, it's not very well described in the scientific literature, but it appears from the images that have been shared that this skin, I mean, look at it, it's glandular. It's not scaly like a reptile at all. It looks much more recognizably like the skin of an animal we might be related to, and of course we are related to. So just to emphasize, some of these animals in the past were referred to as mammal-like reptiles. That's really a very incorrect term to use now, because they're not reptiles at all. They're very much in our family tree, these creatures. And the Gorgonops, well, the Gorgonopsians are amazing, as I said, because they are kind of terrifying. But one thing that's really cool about them is that they're the first animals to develop the specialized saber teeth. Of course, these are much more famous in animals like the saber-toothed cats, like Smilodon, which evolved much, much later in mammal history. But here we have, over 252 million years ago, the first saber teeth. It's really quite cool. So it's so interesting to see this stuff happening very, very early in our evolutionary history. Now, I first encountered a lot of these animals when I was studying fossil trackways in Scotland. So we now, of course, find fossil footprints of all different creatures, including dinosaurs and other animals all around the world. But the first fossil footprints that were found, people didn't really know what to make of them. So the very earliest descriptions of them are from fossils that were found in Scotland. This one pictured there at the side is from a site where the very first fossils were described. And then the ones I'm standing on, these big blocks, because they've got fossil footprints in them. And these are from the same time period. And it's the late Permian into the early Triassic, when Scotland was basically covered in sand dunes. It was a very hot desert country. And some of those footprints belong to those animals that I just described, as well as a few of the reptiles that were living around at the same time. But of course, a good thing never lasts. And in this case, at the end of the Permian, we have one of the most spectacular mass extinctions in the fossil record. I mean, it makes the Cretaceous mass extinction look like a blip by comparison. Now, the end Permian mass extinction, which happened 252 million years ago, it looks like it's not just one, but perhaps several extinctions ramping up to this one mega massive extinction. And it was principally caused by volcanic eruptions. But these were eruptions on a scale that we just can't imagine. Hundreds of thousands of tons of lava were erupted across what's now Siberia. So of course, this would have, in the immediate vicinity, it would have smothered all of the life, animal and plant life. But of course, much, much worse than the immediate impact of lava flows and so on are the gases that come out with volcanoes. These are greenhouse gases. Now, of course, we know because of human-caused climate change that's taking place now, we know what an enormous effect things like carbon dioxide, sulfur, methane, these kinds of greenhouse gases, what effect they have on climate. So with these massive eruptions, we would have, of course, seen dust clouds that would have covered most of the planet, blocking out the sun, killing a lot of the plant life. The sulfur would have reacted with rain clouds to form acid rain, which would have further killed a lot of plant life. And that, of course, would have then starved many of the herbivores and then eventually starved the carnivores as well. We also know that global temperatures rose phenomenally to the point where if you had kind of dipped your foot in the ocean at the equator, it would have been as hot as your evening bath. It was, you know, a good 30 degrees Celsius, the water at times. So this means that we had not only a mass extinction on land, but also a huge mass extinction in the marine realm, in the aquatic world as well. And something like, I mean, estimates vary, but something like 80 to 90% of life on Earth became extinct. So as I say, when we look at all the different mass extinctions that take place over time, there are the so-called big five, and the Permian is by far the biggest of all of those. And of course, we are now in what some people are calling the sixth mass extinction, but where it sits in this overall big pattern of extinctions remains to be seen. And hopefully we can curb it and pull it back so that it ends up being not being the sixth and turning it into the big six instead of the big five. And that's up to us. Of course, this is one of the cool things in a way about this mass extinction taking place now, is in the past, no animals could do anything about it. We have the power to change it. So, of course, lots of animal species may have died, but clearly some stuff made it through, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So in the immediate aftermath of this mass extinction, some of the animals that did the best were actually our relatives on the synapsid line. So creatures like these are called disaster taxa. So these are creatures that do really, really well in the wake of a disaster, but they don't necessarily do well in the long run. And those two creatures you see in the foreground there are a great example of that. These are animals called dicynodonts. They have I think, the distinction of being the only animals in the history of life that have both tusks and beaks. This is the most bizarre combination. And they were plant eaters. And straight after the mass extinction, they were the most common vertebrate animal on the planet. We find them all over the world and all the continents. They were just incredibly successful. And this group, the dicynodonts, they do continue throughout the Triassic. This is now us in the Triassic. And in fact, they give rise to the largest synapsid that would exist until present age, the age of mammals. And that's this creature here, which was found in Poland, which was as big as an elephant. So that's from the late Triassic. So they're a really impressive and very successful group. But the ones that survived the extinction, these first ones that were all over the planet, the Lystrosaurus is what they're called, those particular species didn't last much longer. They just flourished for a little while, and then, of course, nature began to recover. But it took a long time. It took about 20 million years for ecosystems to become as complex as they had been before the mass extinction. Now, of course, you'll notice another little character there, and that's that really fuzzy little dude that's sitting on the tree in the background, and that is the animal that we are going to talk about now. Because earlier in the Permian, I mentioned Procynosuchus, and I was telling you that this was perhaps one of the first members of, in fact, it was one of the first members of the group that we belong to within synapsids, the cynodonts. So we are cynodonts. Now, there's some evidence that animals like Procynosuchus, maybe some of these other creatures in the Permian, might have actually had hair. So these could be the first creatures with whiskers and with fur. Now, one of the lines of evidence for that is this here, which is this is a slide taken from a coprolite, so that's a fossilized poo, fossilized feces, and it's from the Permian. And it's been argued by the researchers that found it that this could be preserved hair that had been eaten by a predator. Now, it's not certain that it is. Some people have argued that it's actually a piece of fungus or something like that, an other kind of filament. So we don't know, not 100% sure. But if it is hair, then it would show us that some of these creatures had whiskers and fur that early in time, over 252 million years ago. But we'll move on a little bit from Procynosuchus into the Triassic, where there's this creature here. This is an animal called Phonaxodon. And it is one of the earliest cynodonts that we know really well from the fossil record. And because we have more of its skeleton, we're able to find out an awful lot about it and about our earliest relatives in the Triassic. And one of the things that Thrinaxodon has told us is it's given us more clues about the appearance of fur and whiskers, and also the appearance of milk, and that these two things might be related to one another. Now, the evidence is it's inference. In other words, it's not a smoking gun. We don't know for sure, but it's really quite compelling. So the first bit of evidence comes from scans like this of Thrinaxodon's skull. Now, here in this scan, two features are highlighted. The pink feature is an infraorbital foramen, so it's basically a hole in the skull that lets nerves and blood vessels go through it. And then the green parts that's highlighted there, those are the canals that nerves and blood vessels are traveling through in the maxilla, which is basically the top part of the mouth, the upper jaw. Now, the reason this is significant is because when we look at those features in the ancestors of mammals, from like the Permian to the Triassic and then to now, we see that up until Thrinaxodon, that green part, those little the canals, the maxillary canals, they're either not there or they're very, very simple. But in Thrinaxodon, you can see lots of little complicated branches. In other words, there's lots of blood vessels and nerves in its upper lip. Why would you have that? Well, if you've got whiskers, you need to have lots of nerves and blood vessels to take all of the information that you get, the sensory information you get from your whiskers, and take them back to the brain in order to sense your environment. So we think that this is evidence that Thrinaxodon at least had whiskers. Otherwise, why did it need to have so much complex nerves and blood vessels? So that's a really cool example of the way that we can get at something that doesn't easily preserve in the fossil record, like fur, by using the things that do preserve, the bones. Now, another thing that we can look at in the skull is something called the parietal foramen. So here you see it in a frog and in a lizard. It's this little hole in the top of the skull, and it is a literal hole right in the top of the skull there that you find in these vertebrate groups. But mammals don't have this feature. It's actually one of the traits of mammals is that we've lost our parietal foramen. Now, our ancestors did in the Permian, they had one, but in the Triassic, this foramen disappears, and Thrinaxodon, in fact, doesn't have it. Now, every now and then, in humans and other mammals, this foramen opens up again. We end up with holes in our skull. And this is due to, it's been discovered that this is linked to particular genes that basically kind of turn that on and off, the appearance of this hole. Now, in laboratory studies with mice, they've discovered that there's a particular gene in mice that not only gives them an infraorbital foramen, a hole in their skull, but it also causes them to have problems with their hair follicle maintenance, so keeping their hair like healthy and moist, and the development of their whiskers, and also the production of their milk. So it looks like the hole in the skull and milk and fur are somehow genetically all connected to each other. So the reason that's significant is because what it suggests is that when we see in an animal like Thrinaxodon that the hole has disappeared, it could be an indication that this gene has changed somehow, or it's turned on or turned off, and that they could be it could not only be a sign of them having fur and having whiskers, but also perhaps even beginning to produce milk. We don't know for sure. And of course, milk's a very, very difficult thing to prove that any animal has in the fossil record because it's obviously doesn't preserve. But it's kind of compelling. So Thrinaxodon's living over 200 million years ago. So this is really early in evolutionary history. But I want to move now into the Jurassic and the time of dinosaurs proper. And now mammals at this time quite famously become extremely small. So this is when mammals, as we know them today, appear, but they're extremely tiny to begin with. So you see creatures like Thrinaxodon, they're pretty big, pretty chunky, size of dogs. But in the late Triassic and into the Jurassic, the earliest mammals, and these are now turning into true mammals, the group that we really do belong to, these creatures are really small. And when I say small, I mean they would curl up and go to sleep in the palm of your hand. They're absolutely tiny. And of course, the dinosaurs famously become very, very large. And in the past, people have interpreted this trend. They've sort of said, oh, well, the dinosaurs are obviously winning, and the mammals are basically just shrinking and they're kind of losing out. And they're just having to, hide from dinosaurs all day long, and they virtually don't make it through. But actually, that's really not the right way to look at it. What we should actually be looking at it as is mammals at this time, they hit on this completely new way of life, this niche that dinosaurs never fill of becoming tiny, hot-blooded hunters. And it looks like most of them were nocturnal at this time. And the reason that we think that is because all groups of modern mammals have lost a lot of the opsins that create the parts of their eye that basically can process lots of color and daylight, basically daylight vision. And they have a lot more of the parts of the eye that are really good for processing low light levels. And so it's thought the reason that this has happened in the whole of mammals is because their common ancestor was nocturnal. And of course, animals like ourselves, the primates, we're one of the only groups that has re-evolved to have full trichromatic color vision. Whereas most animals, like your dog or your cat, they're actually colorblind. And that's partly the legacy of this time period where all mammals were nocturnal. And being nocturnal and being really small has had these phenomenal impacts on the physiology of these really early mammals. So if you're living at night when there's low light and you can't see very much and you're hunting, for example, insects, your senses become much, much more important to you. So we've already talked about whiskers and fur. Whiskers, of course, are exquisite for detecting movement and detecting the environment when you're moving around in the dark. It's possible that they first evolved in burrowing ancestors of mammals so that they could feel their way around in the dark of their tunnels. Mammals also have incredible sense of smell compared to other vertebrate groups, and they also produce a lot more smells. They are the smelliest of all the vertebrates. So these senses begin to develop at this time, and we even see that the size of the parts of the brain that process smell, for example, begin to get larger. And I talked to you before about the middle ear of mammals. And I said that there were 3 bones in the ear as opposed to just 1. And this is the time where we see the origin of those bones. They actually come from the back of the jaw. So reptiles, they have multiple bones that make up their jaw. And the early ancestors of mammals, the synapsids, also had multiple bones in the jaw. But in this period of time, those bones at the back began to shrink, and the main bone, the bone that we still have, the dentary, our jawbone, it became the entire jaw. So those bones that shrank became smaller and smaller, and they were actually incorporated into our ear. So we have stapes, which is what all vertebrates have, but the incus and the malleus used to be part of the back of our jaw in our ancient ancestors. And the reason this is significant is because it gives mammals the most astonishing range of hearing. We've got everything from the ultra high frequencies detected by bats all the way down to the ultra low frequencies detected by whales and elephants and creatures like that. So this opened up a whole new realm of ecological possibilities for mammals. And it really laid the groundwork for mammals as we know them today. Here we have this little hot-blooded creature covered in fur, with extra special senses. Its brain is becoming larger. It's turning into something that we would really recognize as a mammal today. And up until the last sort of 20 years, we thought that was all there was to the story, that basically mammals became small, they became nocturnal, they hunted insects, and that's how they lived for the whole of the time of dinosaurs. But increasingly, particularly from countries like China, we've been getting these really beautiful, complete body fossils. So up until then, we mostly knew mammals from the time of dinosaurs from just teeth and jaws. But you can see here some examples of these beautiful, complete skeletons of mammals from the time of dinosaurs. Some of them even have their fur preserved. They're so beautiful and even articulated. They look like they've just been run over yesterday. Now, why is that insignificant? Well, if you have the entire skeleton, you can start to look at how this animal moved and what it could actually do in its environment. And when we found these fossils, we began to realize that in the time of dinosaurs, we have mammals doing almost everything that small mammals do in their environments today. So in the Jurassic, we have flying squirrel-like mammals. We have diggers. We basically have Jurassic moles. We have specialist tree climbers, and we even have specialist semi-aquatic animals, similar to like an otter or a beaver, that might have even been fish eaters. So mammals were ecologically incredibly diverse in this time period, living alongside the dinosaurs. And one of the ones that's really particularly surprising is this specimen here. So this skeleton, you can see the bottom of it is the tail, and the bit at the top, that's what's left of the skull, and you can see the spine running down the middle. And can you see in the middle of it, just below the ribs, is a big blob, and this is the big blob here. And that's actually the stomach contents of this mammal, which was quite a relatively large mammal for the time period. You know, you can see it's about the size of a cat, and it lived in the early Cretaceous. And this is the remains of its last meal, and they are bones. And when researchers began to look at what bones they were, they realized these were the bones of baby dinosaurs, Psittacosaurus to be exact. So here we have mammals actually eating dinosaurs. So our whole picture that mammals at this time period just spend their whole lives hiding from dinosaurs, quivering in the shadows, is just completely wrong. Mammals were doing all of the exciting things they do today, and some of them were even eating dinosaurs. So here we enter the Cretaceous, and one of the most important things that happens in this time period for not just mammals, but all living organisms is the emergence of the flowering plants. This is one of the first fossils of a flowering plant in the fossil record. It's called Archaefructus, and it comes from China. And it was a very, very small plant that probably grew beside lakes and ponds. So if you imagine that up until this point in the early Cretaceous, there were no flowers on Earth at all. They hadn't evolved yet. But they appear in the early Cretaceous and they very quickly flourish. And of course, they have a huge impact on ecosystems all around the world, because when you have flowers, you can then, of course, begin to have things like nectar. You can begin to have relationships with pollination. So we have the pollinating insects. Many of them, they have their origins around this time too. But also they can produce things like fruits and nuts. So you begin to have ecological niches open up for animals to eat these things as well. So in this time period, not just mammals, but also among insects and among other animal groups, there's this explosion in diversity, an explosion in new species and new ways of life. And one of the studies that looked at this looked at the mammal tree, and you can see there's quite a few different mammal groups there that you might not recognize the names of, like dryolestids, but there's basically lots of different types of mammals that are alive at that time. And there's a band going up and down in the middle of the Cretaceous there, a dark band, and that is the KTR, the Cretaceous Terrestrial Revolution. It's spelled with a K, I'll explain why another time, but KTR. And you see that in the mammal family tree, all of the different mammal groups, suddenly the numbers of species just explode when flowering plants begin to appear and radiate and diversify. And of course, later, that would then, a couple of those groups would then lead to the mammals that are alive today, the placentals and the marsupials. But I talked a lot about the diversity and exciting things that mammals were doing at this time period, but I should put a caveat, which is that actually the groups that we belong to the placental mammals that we belong to, and then also the marsupial mammals, their ancestors actually weren't doing as many interesting things. They were the kind of cliche boring, mousy kind of creatures. A few of them were tree dwellers, but they weren't doing all of those really exciting things. They weren't the moles and the otters and the climbers and the gliders. All of those more exciting mammals belong to groups that are no longer with us today. So myself and my colleagues actually did a study looking at this and kind of asking, why is it that we see this pattern? And what we found is that through the time of the dinosaurs, you see on this graph that our ancestors, that's in blue, the crown therians they're called. Now this graph is basically charting how kind of diverse and interesting they were in terms of what they could do in their body size and in what, you know, their ecology. And you can see that we're actually, our graph, our blue graph there, it's a bit kind of low compared to the other groups. And these are the ones I was talking about earlier, these ecologically diverse animals. So what we think is happening in this time period is that these other types of mammals are actually kind of occupying all the niche space and doing all the interesting things, which means that our direct ancestors, these crown therians, weren't able to exploit any of those ways of living. But of course, we return to that fateful moment, the point that most people begin this story, but I'm actually going to end the story here when, at the end of the Cretaceous, this mass extinction occurs thanks to an asteroid hitting our planet. Because famously, of course, it wipes out the dinosaurs, but it also wiped out many of those other mammal groups. It removed lots of those diverse, flourishing groups that I talked about earlier. But our group, those therians, they were one of the ones that made it through. And of course, as we famously know, gave rise to this incredible diversity we see on the planet today. Now, why did those mammals make it through? And why did birds make it through when so many other animals became extinct? Well, I like to kind of think about this a little bit differently. We always get these stories about this, you know, the asteroid hits and it's like a disaster movie and there's explosions and there's fire and all the rest of this. But think for a second what it might be like if you are a little warm-blooded mammal, you burrow, so you live deep underground, and you might be down there, you might even be hibernating. You might not notice that above on the surface, there's this mass extinction taking place because you are in a climate-controlled burrow. You know, as long as you can find food, and of course, you could eat some of the dead bodies up on the surface to survive. As long as you can find food, you can give birth to your litters of young, and you can feed them on milk and bring them up, and you can make it through. And if you're covered in fur, that can keep you warm through the nuclear winter when you're up on the surface scavenging. And actually, for some mammals, perhaps rather than being a disaster story, this period could have actually just been a godsend. It could have been a fantastic time for a little furry mammal to be alive. And if we look at some of the features that are shared between mammals and birds, which of course also made it through and did very, very well and are flourishing today, they both have elevated body temperatures, you know, they're warmer blooded, both have a covering of fur in one case, feathers in the other, and they both take care of their young. So these could be some of the features that made them so adaptable and able to make it through this disaster when many, many other previously successful groups were not. And there are many different models for exactly how mammals then radiated into all the groups we know today. So I'm not going to pick one as the favorite model. There's a possibility that mammals, our ancestors, weren't doing much until straight after the extinction, which is the kind of explosive model where you see suddenly they diversify. But other researchers suggest they actually had already begun to diversify before the extinction, and they just continued. And it's difficult to say exactly what the pattern is because the evidence we get from looking at their genes and tracing back the genetics gives different answers from the fossil record. So trying to work out what exactly the real pattern is very difficult. But in a way, it doesn't really matter because we know that in the so-called time of the age of mammals, mammals did diversify and did become successful and basically become all of the incredible creatures that we see around us today. And eventually, of course, we are lucky enough to have appeared as well and get to be able to study all of this and try and work out how it all came to be.
Thank you so much. So that was really great. You do have a couple of questions, but because of time, I think we're only going to be able to ask you two.
Okay.
So the first one is for high school students who maybe want to go into a field of evolution or paleo botany or biology and studying prehistoric animals or organisms. What a lot of times they need experience to get experience.
Yeah, I
So when they
know.
apply for something, it's like, well, yeah, you can be a volunteer, but you need to have volunteered before. So do you have
Yeah.
any advice on how to get a foothold into the field?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. And also because quite often they want you to have experience, but you might not have access to anything like that. There might not be anything nearby, or, you might have to travel quite far, and not everybody can do that. So it's a bit difficult. I mean, I think the thing I would say is that if you look around and basically anything that you can do to volunteer, and it doesn't have to directly be a museum, it could be anything that shows that you have the kind of skills that you can then argue are really useful for being a paleontologist. So, for example, when I realized I wanted to get into paleontology, there was absolutely nothing like that in the Highlands of Scotland where I grew up, but there was a lot of archaeology, so the study of human history. And I thought, well, they do a lot of the same stuff. They dig things up, they take lots of, notes, they arrange their specimens, they have to, put them in museums. So I actually volunteered with some archaeologists. And then when I went to go into paleontology, I said, look, I haven't touched fossils, but I've done all this other stuff and it's all related. And I know how to be really careful with things and stuff like that. So try and think like that. Think about what you might do that gets you those sorts of skills for organizing things, for digging things up really carefully, working in teams, and labeling and sorting. And also, I think a lot of paleontologists now, there's a lot of computer skills involved. And again, that's something that you don't have to directly do it with science. You could be doing it with something else. So you could show that you've used like data entry systems or something like that. So try and think laterally about it. Think of other places where you can get the same skills, even if they're not directly in paleontology. You have to think creatively about it.
All right, the last question because of time, because I imagine classes are going to other classes, is we'll take Mrs. Jordan's 10th grade class. They would like to know, how often do you get to hold real bones? And I'll just add, I'm guessing they're talking about like a actual bone compared to like something that's petrified or mineralized.
Well, I'll answer both.
Okay.
So if it's real bones or if it's fossils, I get to hold both quite often. So in my office, I have lots of the bones of mammals that live today, because I use them to compare with my fossils. But I also, of course, have several fossils that I'm studying, and I will, I'll have them either in my office or I'll go to where they are in the lab and touch them as well, and look at them. So I do get to, really quite often. But more often than that, I'll look at them digitally. So I have like CT scans of bones, and I'll be looking at them on the computer screen. I do a lot of work on computers now, so a bit of both.
All right, if you can do two quick questions.
Yeah, I can. I'm seeing them in the chat. I can
Yeah,
probably answer a couple.
do modern mammals make spiral burrows that could be mistaken for prehistoric fossil burrows?
So mammals make all different types of patterns of burrows, and some of them are spiral. And in the fossil record, we have found some spiral burrows. There's some really amazing ones from South Africa and also from the North American continent. Could they be mistaken for prehistoric ones? Probably not. So when a burrow is preserved in the fossil record, it's usually because it's been filled in with sediment and has turned to stone. So a modern burrow, of course, is empty. So like in the fossil record, it's the opposite, it's been filled in. So it's unlikely you'd make the mistake.
And Sarah asked, is there a way to see traces of milk in the fossils or the production structures or tissues?
Probably not. I mean, aside from thinking about like Star Trek-like technology in the future, where you never know, at the moment, definitely not. There's just no way, because if you think about, fossil records mostly made of bones, and even the bones that do preserve, they don't preserve perfectly. A lot of them are damaged or only partial. Things like hair, all these kind of softer tissues, hair, eye, organs, things like that. It's really, really rare that they would preserve. So there's a very small possibility that if we were to find a mammal preserved in absolutely exceptional circumstances where you actually get the organs as well, you might be able to see some kind of structure, but I think it's very unlikely. But I'd love it. I wish we could find that. That would be great.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you to all of the teachers and students who attended this live. And thank you, Dr. Elsa Panciroli, for doing a wonderful presentation. And
thank you so much. And I'm really sorry I was late. Thank you for being so patient.
not a problem. And for everyone else who's watching this recording, this is the last one of the school year, but we will be back for next year, September through May, with more authors and more scientists to talk about evolution.